Worship, and by that we mean our whole Riverwood family. Oftentimes we have part of our family here and part of our family down the halls, but today we get to all be together. And with that, I hope your kids grabbed one of these as a kids bulletin on your way in. In fact, if you didn't, parents, maybe raise your hand. This will actually help them follow along, both during the sermon. It has even some questions for kids to ask their parents when they go home. So, anyone need any? There's one down here, a couple over here on the side. They can bring them around. Just keep your hand up. They'll find you. All right. Hey, I wanted to start just by giving a quick update. I know many of you are following along kind of with what's going on with our family, so thank you for praying for us. I was telling somebody in between services, I feel like we're crowd surfing, being held up by all of your guys' prayers as we go through this. Nathan's still in the hospital. He's in the ICU, day 13 or whatever. So good news, he's off the ventilator now, and he's apparently slowly getting better. They haven't given us any sort of timeline on when he'll come home, but we're taking one day at a time. So thank you for praying. I just wanted to at least keep you in the loop there. So thanks for that. Okay, so to our topic this morning. We have 5 senses, right? 5 senses. In fact, there's kids in the room. Can any of the kids tell me one of the 5 senses? Yes. Smelling, yes, the sense of smell, yes. Hearing. Sight. Yes. Yes, feeling or touch. One more. Yes. Taste. Okay, what you might not know is that there is a 6th sense. And I'm not talking about the ability to see dead people. That's not what I'm talking about. No, there is a 6th sense, or what I'm calling a 6th sense. And this is the ability or the, the awareness to know when you're being treated unfairly. Right? We all have this sense. As soon as we're being treated unfairly, some sort of alarm goes off in our head, doesn't it? We can just sense something's not right. Someone's wrong, doing wrong to us. We're being treated unfairly. In fact, kids seem to have the best ability to tell this. And you can see this. How many of you have heard the phrase, "that's not fair," in your home? Let me see your hands. Anyone heard that? Yeah, usually it's accompanied with certain facial expressions, sometimes a tone of voice, maybe your shoulders get into it. That's not fair. I was talking to my sister earlier this week, and she said that last Sunday, her and her husband, they both ended up with cars at church, and so they were getting ready to drive home, and they have 5 kids, and so there's always a little argument, well, who gets to ride with who? And the oldest, Jake, he wanted to ride with Dad, right? Well, he didn't get to, and apparently his sister got to, and the day before she did as well, and so you know what he said. He said, "That's not fair, it's my turn." Or later in the day, my sister was baking cookies, and she said that her daughter Eden, she had a cookie earlier at a birthday party, and then she let her have a cookie there, so she had 2 cookies. Well, her younger sister, Cammie, came and asked for a cookie, got one, and then wanted a second. And when she said no, she said, "That's not fair. Edie had 2 cookies." Kids have this ability to tell when things are fair. But it doesn't really change when we get older. We might get a little better at hiding it, maybe internalizing it. Maybe we don't pout as much. But we still have this sense of when we're being treated unfairly. Someone at work who maybe hasn't been there as long as you, and they get the promotion that you'd been hoping for. Wait a minute, that's not fair. Maybe someone is spreading around a gossip or something that's just not true. And now everyone knows it. And that's not fair. We all have this 6th sense. This ability to just know when we're not being treated fairly. And the question that I want us to wrestle with this morning, that I think our passage has us wrestle with, is how should we respond when we're being treated unfairly? When someone wrongs you, when someone says something or does something and it's unfair, how are you supposed to respond to them? The world will tell us how to respond, right? The natural human response when you're being treated unfairly is what? It's to get even, right? Payback time. The scales have been tipped. It's not fair, so as quickly as we can, we want to bring things back to balance. This is what was happening in the church of Corinth. Paul, in his letter, he's responding to a number of different issues. We've been looking at them for the last few weeks. He's trying to teach this church about holiness. But in the passage we're going to look at this morning, this is the situation we find. Person A has wronged person B. We don't know exactly what happened. It probably has something to do with land. Person A thought this was their land boundaries, and they started farming all of that land. And then person B said, no, you can't do that. This part is my land. You can't take my land. You can't steal from me. And what they were doing is person B was suing person A, taking him to court, said, we will settle this way. And Paul is furious. In fact, as you'll see in our passage, Paul is probably the most ticked off that he has been in this whole letter, which is saying something because he's already talked about factions in the church. He's already talked about sexual immorality, but this is the issue that gets under his skin the most. And we'll talk about why. Now, to us, this doesn't seem like that big of a deal. If you're wronged, go ahead and sue. Get what's rightfully yours. Stand up for your rights. We live in a culture that loves litigation, right? In fact, we have whole TV shows dedicated to watching people sue each other. In fact, I talked to a parent earlier this week, and he said, my kids, they threaten to sue me almost every day. This doesn't seem that out of the ordinary, and yet to Paul, it's a huge deal. It's a huge deal that one believer would sue another believer. So what I want us to do is to first read this passage, okay? So if you have a Bible, open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. We're going to look at the first 6 verses. You can tell Paul is pretty mad. When Paul gets mad, he starts asking questions that they should know the answer to. And in these 8 verses, he asks 8 different questions. So you can tell he's running hot. Listen to the first 8 verses. He says, when one of you has a grievance against another, does he dare go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that we are to judge angels? How much more then matters pertaining to this life? So, if you have such cases, why do you lay them before those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is no one among you wise enough to settle a dispute between the brothers? But brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers. To have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? But you yourselves, you wrong and defraud, even your own brothers. Here's what I want us to do this morning. We're trying to answer the question, how should we respond when we're treated unfairly? And I think as we look at this passage, Paul is first going to lay out his plan B, and then he's going to give us plan A. He's going to start with plan B. This is the second best option of how to respond. But then he's going to give us the preferred response, plan A. So let's first start with his plan B. We see this in verse 1. Plan B is take it to the church, not the court. If you have a dispute, if 2 believers, they can't agree on something, don't sue each other. Don't take it to court. Deal with it within the family of Christ. Now, you can see this in the implied answer to the question in verse 1. He says, when one of you has a grievance against one another, does he dare go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? The implied answer is, well, you should know this. If you have a problem, if you have a dispute, keep it within the family. Deal with it within the church. Don't take each other to court. You think about it, Christians like doing business together. They do. If, for example, if you need plumbing done on your house, well, there's probably 20 different plumbers you could choose from. But oftentimes Christians choose a plumber from within their church body. They probably need the work. It's kind of a way we take care of each other. Christians do business together. It's been like that for thousands of years. You need an accountant. Well, to help you with your taxes, why not pick someone from the church? You need someone to do your roof, or your car needs some body work done. We often do business together. Well, one of the hazards of doing business together is sometimes things don't go very well. And sometimes problems arise that aren't very easily solved. And so Paul is saying the correct way to respond when you get to that sort of standstill is to take it to the church. Have someone in the church help you resolve that. And what Paul's going to do in the next couple verses is he's going to answer the question, why? So take it to the church, not the court. Well, why? And Paul's going to lay out two different reasons. The first reason is he says to the church, you are capable to judge. You are able, you are competent, you are able to handle matters that come up. You can help each other in this way. Look at verse 2 and 3. He says, or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that you are to judge angels? How much more than matters pertaining to this life? You see what he's saying? He's making an argument from the greater to the lesser. He's saying you as believers, one day you are going to be a part of judging the world. You're going to be a part of judging angels. Now that might be news to some of you, but in the book of Daniel, Jesus, they both talk about how we are going to join Jesus in judging the world. And so Paul's saying, hold on a second. If someday you're going to judge the world, certainly you should be competent enough to be able to judge the minor disputes. And even if they're not that minor, compared to judging the world, any dispute is going to seem minor. So Paul says, you can handle this. You can handle it within yourselves. Help each other reconcile. Look at verse 4. He says, so if you have such cases, why do you lay them before those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is no one wise enough among you to settle a dispute between the brothers? Now this would have been a slap in the face for the Corinthians. He says, is there anyone wise enough among you? Remember what they were proclaiming in the first few chapters? The Corinthians were proud. What were they proud of? They were proud of their wisdom. They thought they had attained to this certain wisdom. And now Paul is saying, hey, do you not even have anyone wise enough to help you with these disputes? Paul, he's going for the jugular. He says, I say this to your shame. He hates what they're doing. He hates it because they're capable of handling it. But he hates it for another reason, and probably he hates it the most for this reason, is that what they're doing, suing each other, that hurts the Christian witness before a watching world. Look at verse 6. He says, but brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers. Non-Christians, unbelievers, they're constantly watching us. They're constantly watching the church. It's been like this from the beginning. They were doing this back then. They're doing this now. They're constantly looking in and saying, I wonder if Jesus is really who he says he is. They say he's completely changed their life. Well, we'll see. I'm going to sit back and I'm going to watch. And what were they seeing in Corinth? They were seeing two Christians who couldn't agree, taking each other to court. Well, people watching would say, well, that's what we do. They're no different than who we are. Jesus must not be all he's cracked up to be. And Paul hates what's happening. When we can't agree, it sends a message to the outside world. I used to work for a guy named Mike. He was a developer, and I used to do some construction work for him when I was in high school. But one time he needed a bathroom replaced in his house, and so he was thinking about who to hire. Well, he decided to hire a guy named Pat, who was from the church. And so Pat did the work, kind of fixed the bathroom. Well, a couple weeks later, there's a flood in the basement. And so Mike calls Pat back, lots of damage, and says, Pat, look what happened. You know, you fixed the bathroom, and now I've got all this water in my basement. I need you to help make this right. And Pat said, oh, that wasn't me. And he's like, come on, man. This was just a week after you fixed this. They're related. I need you to own this and help me out here. And they couldn't agree. And Mike, they're both Christians. Mike, he wants to follow this passage. And so he doesn't want to just sue him for what he should get. He decides, let's ask Tim, a mutual kind of friend, a Christian, to kind of hear the whole story to help us resolve this issue. He's trying to take this passage at its word, trying to help solve the dispute. I think that's what Paul's saying here. He could be saying, when you have a problem you can't solve, take it to the elders. He could mean that. He could mean take it to the pastors. He probably means find some wise Christian among you and have him help you sort it out. Lots of couples end up doing this. Their marriage gets to kind of a standstill and they decide, what? We need help. We need some other Christian, a counselor of some sort to kind of to help us figure out how to reconcile. That's a great step. It's a great application of this passage. Paul, his command is pretty straightforward. If you have some sort of conflict you can't resolve, handle it within the church. Which brings me to a question. Is it ever legitimate for believers to take things to the secular court? Is there ever a legitimate scenario when believers should use the secular court system? It's a good question. One, in fact, I think we have to use a different passage to help balance this passage. In Romans chapter 13, Paul, he talks about the government, and he says, God established the government. God's the one who's given it authority. So how do we sort this out? In fact, you look at Paul's life. Remember when he was arrested? He appeals to Caesar. So how do we kind of reconcile? Don't go to the courts, but then I think the way we can reconcile this is there's a difference between a sin and a crime. Most of the time crimes are sins, but there's a difference between a sin and a crime. Crimes, God has established the government to deal with. Sins, they're supposed to be handled within the church. So you don't call 911 and say, quick, Susie just gossiped, hurry. No, that's a sin. That's not a crime in our culture. So that should be dealt with. That should be handled within the church. But if you see a believer committing a crime, well, that's why God has put the government. That's why God has established things like the police. So I think what Paul is saying is excluding crimes in things that just have to do with sin, things that he says deal with those within the church. Don't get the courts involved. Now, that's Paul's plan B. I don't think you're going to really like Paul's plan A. Plan A is a lot harder than plan B. But Paul's preference, what he would love for the church to do, is plan A. And plan A is to overlook the offense. Someone's wronged you. Someone's done something to you. Paul's preferred method of how you deal with that is just to overlook it. Look at verse 7 and 8. He says, to have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather suffer wrong? Why not rather be defrauded? But you yourselves wrong and defraud even your own brothers. You can see his preference in those questions. Why not just rather suffer wrong? Why not allow yourself to be cheated? That is his preference. Maybe someone owes you a lot of money. Maybe you've made some sort of verbal contract with someone. Maybe someone has said something very mean to you at school. And Paul says, let it go. Forgive. Overlook the offense. And if you're like me, you're saying, are you kidding me? This is incredibly hard to do. Now, where do you think Paul got this? Why do you think Paul says that the best way to handle when you're treated unfairly is just to overlook it? Why does he say that? Paul says this because Jesus taught this. We see this in Jesus' teaching, and we see it in his example. Look at Matthew 5, what Jesus has to say about this. He says, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him too. Now this just seems crazy to us. Jesus said, if someone wrongs you, say they punch you in the face, say they steal something from you, how are you to respond? He doesn't say get revenge. He doesn't say get even. He says, no, let it go. Forgive them. And more than that, continue loving them. Remain generous towards them. But Jesus did a lot more than just teach this. He lived this. Look at what Peter had to say in 1 Peter 2 when thinking about Jesus. He says, when they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. Now, I think we can all agree that Jesus was the most unfairly treated person in all of human history, right? Of any of us, Jesus was the most unfairly treated, and yet how did he respond? He didn't make threats. He didn't take revenge. He had all power at his disposal, and yet he just took it. And more than that, he prayed, right? He prayed for those who were killing him. He prayed, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Jesus, he taught us how to respond. He modeled how we are to respond. We're to forgive. We're to let it go. We're to just take it. Now, that is a lot easier said than done, isn't it? That sounds great until all of a sudden you're wronged. And you know, okay, I'm supposed to let it go. I'm supposed to forgive. But that is really hard. So the question is how? How on earth are we supposed to do this? How are we supposed to actually forgive someone when they've wronged us? And I think Jesus tells a story to help us. He tells a story that helps us with this how question. How are we actually supposed to forgive? You'll know this story. He tells a story of a king who wants to settle his accounts with his servants. So he brings the first servant in, and this servant owes him $10 million. He has a huge debt. So the king says, all right, pay me $10 million. And the servant, he doesn't have it, right? So the king says, all right, well, sell him, sell his wife, sell his kids, sell all his possessions, try to recoup as much of the debt as you can. All right, next case. Well, you remember what the servant does? The servant, he just starts weeping. He breaks down. He falls on his knees. He says, King, please, I'm begging you, be compassionate. Take mercy on me. Be patient. I'll pay you back. And the king, he's a good king. He's a compassionate king. And so you know what he does? He decides out of his generosity just to forgive the debt completely. He just cancels it. He takes pity on him and says, okay, and he erases it. Imagine you're that servant. You walked into the room with this debt of $10 million on your shoulders, and just like that, it's gone. Story continues. The servant walks out of the king's chambers and immediately finds one of his coworkers who owes him $10. He grabs that coworker and says, pay me what you owe me. And the coworker says, I don't have it right now. I'll be patient. I'll pay you back. And he says no, and he throws him in prison. And everybody who watches all that just happened, they go and tell the king. And the king has that servant brought back in, and the king says, you wicked servant, I canceled your enormous debt. How can you not cancel the small debt of your coworker? And the power of this story is that you and I are this servant. You and I, we had this enormous debt that we owed to God. We had offended an infinitely holy and perfect God. And he forgave us. He canceled it. He took it in the person of his son. He invited us into his family. So we're trying to answer this how question. How on earth can we forgive other people? The only way we can forgive other people is by remembering how he has already forgiven and overlooked our offense. The only way you and I will ever be able to let it go is by focusing our attention in on how he has already let our offense go. This is the same argument from the greater to the smaller. God has canceled our enormous debt. Anything anyone does to us is very small compared to that. Sure, it might be a few $1,000s. It might be something mean someone said at school. It might be work someone's done on your house that went wrong. But that's why Paul's saying you just need to overlook it, let it go. How do you do that? You do that by remembering God has forgiven our offense, and that gives us the ability to forgive those that wrong us. Every time we talk about this topic, a certain question comes to mind. And that is that, wait a second, if every time I'm punched, I'm supposed to turn the other cheek, if every time someone steals from me, I'm supposed to give the thief more money, if every time I'm wronged, I'm supposed to just overlook it, well, aren't people just going to take advantage of me? To which the answer is maybe yes. But there's an even deeper question behind that. The even deeper question is God really going to take care of me? If I actually forgive people, if I actually let things go, is God going to take care of me? And this is where faith really becomes faith. You actually have to step out and trust, okay, if I do what God is asking me to do, he will take care of me. And that is a lot easier said than done at times. And that's why we just have to daily keep preaching the gospel to ourselves, keep reminding ourselves of all that God has forgiven, so that we can then, in turn, forgive others. I was telling you about my old boss, Mike. Even when he and Pat got this Christian arbitrator, this Christian middleman to help them resolve, they couldn't come to a point of resolution. So my boss, he had a choice to make. Is he going to sue him to get his money back, or is he just going to, it's a few $1,000s. The only way he could do that is by remembering all that God had forgiven and say, you know what, I can forgive a few $1,000. Let me give you another example. This is a relational example because I think this happens a lot more frequently. We have relational times where we need to forgive. About 5 years ago, one of Jen's friends, I'll call her Kelly, she did something to Jen that was very hurtful. I don't think she realized how hurtful it was. But watching the whole situation kind of from the outside, I thought that friendship was over. I mean, every one of Jen's friends was just saying, yeah, you just need to move on. You're not going to be friends with that person anymore. It was really hurtful. And I don't think Kelly ever really realized how hurtful she was. She never came and apologized. But yet Jen wanted to fight for that friendship. And she decided, you know what? That was really painful, but I'm going to let it go. And the only way she could let it go is by remembering how God had let her faults go. And what's amazing to watch is how that friendship has continued to grow and blossom. That would never have happened if Jen had held on to that. A lot of our relationships are going to be a year long and then end, a year long and then end. If we don't learn how to, let go, if we don't learn how to forgive, we're going to hurt each other. We're going to need to forgive. So this is a very practical passage. Who has hurt you? Probably someone's coming to mind. Who has done something or said something and it hurts? God, he may be asking you to try to find another believer to help you kind of reconcile. Or he may be saying, you know what? Let it go. Just overlook it. Forgive them. They don't deserve it. You didn't deserve my forgiveness. Just let it go. You and I, we're always going to have this sixth sense. We're going to go through life and we're going to be treated unfairly and alarms are going to go off in our head and we're going to know it. We can't control that. But what we can control is how we respond when we're treated unfairly. We can follow in the footsteps of our Savior and we can overlook those offenses. We can forgive those around us. Let me pray for us to that end. God, this is a passage that is much easier to talk about than it actually is to do. And so, Lord, when we need to let go, help us focus on how you have let go, how you have forgiven, how you have overlooked our offense, so that we can in turn forgive others. Lord, we know you are the perfect judge. One day you're going to make everything right. Help us to entrust ourselves into your care and know that we can freely forgive, knowing you will take care of us. We love you and we thank you for all this in Jesus' name. Amen.